And so this technological revolution was kicking off here in the West. And at the same time, there was a kind of a spiritual revolution happening in the Middle East, with this young man in Iran known as the Bab, the gate, at the forefront of it. But the Bab had been publicly executed on the orders of the king of Iran. And really, to all outward appearances, his message just seemed like a lost cause. These great waves of persecution continued across his country, wiping out his followers. And all of the most eminent disciples of the Bab were put to death. Except for one, who was a young Persian nobleman, whose name was Baha'u'llah, which is a name that means the glory of God. And this young nobleman, Baha'u'llah, because he came from a noble family, he was not killed, but he was arrested and chained up and thrown into one of the most notorious prisons of the time, the Black Pit of Tehran. And this place wasn't really a prison at all. It was an old underground cistern, almost like an old sewer, way down deep beneath the city, where the worst of the worst criminals were sent to be thrown down there and be cut off from society. This was a place with no light, with no heat, with no sanitary facilities. Descriptions have been written about the very stench of this place. It was probably the most horrendous physical environment that you could possibly imagine. And so this young nobleman, Baha'u'llah, was sent down into this black pit. And down there, where he was 4 stories underneath the earth and chained by his neck to the floor, Baha'u'llah later described that in that dark, filthy dungeon, he experienced a kind of overpowering vision which came to him and shook him to his core and called him to reveal to the world that he was in fact the one who the Bab had prepared the way for, the one for whom all of the world's religions, way up there in the world above him, were waiting. He was the promised one, sent into the world to build peace on earth. And yet there he was in this underground dungeon in chains. But after having survived in the Black Pit for 4 months as a prisoner, Baha'u'llah was released on the condition that he would leave his homeland and never return. And so he was banished from Iran, and he was sent into exile in Iraq, where he could live with some degree of freedom, but his life would never be the same. His entire home village back in Iran was burned to the ground, and he could never go home. And so Baha'u'llah lived in exile in Iraq, in Baghdad, for the following 10 years. But for these 10 years, he told nobody about this experience, this vision that he had had down in the Black Pit. He told nobody who he really was. Not even the scattered remaining followers of the Bab, who were so anxiously waiting for the promised one to appear somewhere soon. But he actually kept this a secret. And really with the wisdom of a mother who gradually introduces new foods to her baby as the baby becomes ready, Baha'u'llah began very gradually to introduce new concepts to the people around him. He began to teach the people through 2 ways, really. Firstly, through his own life, the way he lived, the way he interacted with people, with a kind of all-embracing universal love and respect, regardless of people's religion or race or class or social position. And secondly, through his pen, through the power of his writing. And from the moment that Baha'u'llah was released from the Black Pit and was expelled from his homeland, from this moment, something had happened inside of him, and this kind of ocean of inspired writings, this inspired knowledge began to pour out of his mind into books and letters and prayers and poems and writings on all sorts of subjects, from religion to philosophy to science and medicine and the arts and music to economics and governance and law, down to the deepest mysteries of the human soul, this vast ocean of inspired writings. And these writings began to have such an effect on the people around him in Baghdad that the different communities of the city, people who normally did not associate with each other and in many cases really carried centuries of prejudice and hostility towards each other, these different communities, through the influence of Baha'u'llah, began to not only accept each other, but to actually appreciate and value each other, and to see each other in Baha'u'llah's words as the different branches of one tree, all ultimately coming from the same root. In fact, there's a saying in some of these writings which I love because it's very musical. It says that the diversity of the human family should be a cause of love and harmony, just as it is in music, where many different notes blend together in the making of a perfect chord. And so Baha'u'llah began to blend together these different people in the city around him and teach them how to live in a society in harmony, just like in music. So for the next song, Jasmine and I would like to actually sing some of these words that Baha'u'llah wrote during this time when he was living in exile in Baghdad. These words come from one of Baha'u'llah's most well-known books called The Hidden Words. And this is a short poetic verse about the meaning of love, particularly in times of difficulty and trials. So this is called The Sign of Love. O Son of Man, for everything there is a sign, the sign of love is fortitude.
The sign of love is patience.
The sign of love is So these words, these writings of this exiled nobleman, Baha'u'llah, began to spread around, really like wildfire. First all around Baghdad, and then all over Iraq. And soon enough these writings were spreading all over the Middle East, which at the time was largely under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, one of the biggest empires in the history of the world. And as these writings continued to spread further and further afield, eventually the same thing that had happened to the Bab began to happen to Baha'u'llah. The authorities became threatened by the influence that he was having. They had done away with the Bab. But now here was this exiled prisoner, Baha'u'llah, who was having an even greater impact on people's minds and people's hearts, and they felt very threatened by the kinds of things that he was teaching people. For example, Baha'u'llah was teaching people first and foremost. He was teaching people that humanity is one, and that no race of people, no nation of people is any more or less valuable than any other race or nation of people. In fact, there's a famous saying of Baha'u'llah. He said, the earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. This is a sentiment that has become almost obvious to us now as history has unfolded. But at the time that he was saying this was a very staggering idea to put into the world. This was at a time when there were large groups of people who were considered by their societies as being less than human because of the colour of their skin, or the religion of their ancestors, or the nation of their birth. So this was a very kind of challenging concept to put into the world, to say that all humanity are citizens of the world. He was also teaching people the concept that religion is one, and that all of the great world religions which have appeared throughout history at different times, in different places, in different ways, ultimately derive their inspiration, in his words, from one heavenly source, from one God, like different chapters of one book unfolding throughout history, chapter after chapter. And that the founders of the great world religions, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Krishna, Buddha, Zoroaster, Muhammad, he said these are like the sun which comes up one morning and it lights up the world, and we say it's Monday. And it comes up again the next morning and it lights up the world again, and we say it's Tuesday. And it comes up the next morning and we say it's Wednesday. And all of these days are different. They have different names. They have different characteristics. They even really play a different role in the big picture of the whole week as it unfolds. But really it's always the same sun rising from different points on the horizon to bring the same sunlight to the world. And Baha'u'llah was teaching people that these extraordinary figures who have really given the biggest creative impulses that have propelled civilization forward, he was saying these extraordinary messengers of God, or as he called them, he wanted to give them an even higher title. He called them manifestations of God. He said these are like this sun rising from age to age to enlighten humanity, and to really to educate us and guide us and help us as we all kind of stumble and fumble around through life, trying to grapple with the big questions that we all grapple with, of, the big questions of what does it mean to be a human being. He was also insisting that the true purpose of religion, however often it may be forgotten or neglected, the true purpose of religion, he insisted, is in fact to bring people together in a spirit of their common humanity, to unite people beyond their colour, beyond their nation or their language or their political opinion, to unite people at a much deeper spiritual level of their hearts is really the true purpose of religion. And he pressed this point to such a degree that he said that if religion becomes so distorted by man as to become a cause of hatred in the world or in our hearts, then really it's better not to have religion at all. He was also promoting the equality of men and women and the importance of universal education, especially for young girls, because he pointed out that mothers are really the primary educators of all humanity. In the vast majority of cases, our mothers are our first teachers, really, the moment we come into the world. And so he stressed that really the education of women must really take a priority in the modern world if humanity is to truly advance. And he pressed this point to such a degree that he said that for as long as women are prevented from developing their potential and using their talents to contribute to the advancement of civilization, as long as they are prevented from doing that, men themselves will be deprived of their own potential. And again, this was another very challenging idea. This was at a time when in the vast majority of societies, women were not even allowed to vote. And finally, perhaps most importantly, Baha'u'llah was teaching people a very important principle for their individual lives, which he called the independent investigation of truth. He was empowering people to look at things with their own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and to really strive to overcome the different prejudices that we see in the world and that have just wreaked so much havoc on humanity's history, and which are always the result of looking through the eyes of others instead of looking through our own eyes. Because, you know, we look at children, and children have no prejudices, they just are what they are, but we all grow up and we all acquire all sorts of prejudices from different fears and different experiences that we have, and we have to constantly question them and work our way through them. And Baha'u'llah was really asking people to strive to overcome every form of prejudice in their lives and their relationships, and that the best way to do this was to focus on the investigation of truth in all matters. And so after 10 years of living in exile and teaching these things, the authorities finally said enough, and they decided to exile Baha'u'llah a second time, this time to the city of Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, where he could be kept under the supervision of the Sultan, one of the most powerful men in the world. And on the eve of his departure from Baghdad, as he was leaving the city, Baha'u'llah stopped in a rose garden just on the outskirts of the city. And in this rose garden, he finally revealed this secret that he had kept in his heart for 10 years, even though many people had already started to quietly guess it already, because they had really witnessed their society being transformed by his presence. But for the first time, Baha'u'llah announced to the people around him that he was the one who the Bab had prepared the way for, the one for whom all of the world's religions had been waiting for thousands and thousands of years. He was the promised one, and they didn't have to wait any longer. And he said that he was going to deliver to the world a new divine message which would enable humanity to build universal peace together. And that the great miracle of this message was that it would finally reconcile the world's great religions and bring humanity together as one united but diverse family. So this next piece is called Strange Miracles.